Hey everyone, I'm your host, Camille. Welcome back to Unfulfilled. As you can tell from the title, if you're new here, we dive into all the ways that our lives can be more fulfilling and talk about all the real things that we're feeling and experiencing on our growth journeys. Thank you so much for showing up. I'm so grateful you're here. Thank yourself for showing up for yourself today by tuning into the show. We have a really great topic that I'm very excited about. So if you're listening to this, you likely also struggle with perfectionism. Or maybe you know someone in your life that's close to you that struggles with perfectionism. And if you do, take a pause right now, send this episode to them. I promise you won't regret it. We're going to dive into some really great topics, whether you have perfectionist tendencies, whether you don't know if you have perfectionist tendencies, or whether you're close to someone who has perfectionist tendencies. This is going to be a really great episode. So send this to someone right now who might benefit from it. And before diving in, if you're not already, if you would just press the subscribe or follow button wherever you are listening on Spotify or Apple, it will really help my efforts to grow and expand the Unfulfilled community, and it will give you access to episodes every Monday when they come out. So do it for yourself and your growth journey. And again, I'm so grateful you're here. So let's dive in. So again, if you're tuning in here, you likely also struggle with perfectionism. Today, we're going to dive into this topic. And I love talking about this topic because not only do I myself definitely tend to struggle with perfectionist tendencies, but also because I think so many of us do. And the really interesting thing is perfectionism can often be disguised as so many different things. I think a lot of us don't know whether we struggle from perfectionism or not. Might be unsure whether it's something that you experience. So we're going to clear that up today. Not to mention that there has been a rise in perfectionism from younger people today since the 1980s. So this is why I know that I now likely have a lot of your attention talking about this topic because a lot more of us experience this than we like to think, and it's on the rise. Enough rambling. Today what we're going to talk about is what perfectionism is, why we have these tendencies, what it could look like in our lives, and practices to overcome perfectionism. So starting out with the basics, what is perfectionism? Is a personality characteristic that is defined as striving for flawlessness and setting exceedingly high standards or performance, accompanied by tendencies for overly critical evaluations. So first thing to clarify, being a perfectionist by no means that you're perfect or flawless. It's not necessarily a badge of honor to wear that deems you flawless or deems you perfect, but it actually stems from deeper insecurities and a desire to control our surroundings because we don't feel worthy or enough within. So perfectionism really is a defense mechanism to control our external surroundings in a desperate attempt to avoid any kind of suffering or discomfort or triggering ourselves. So our mind tricks us into believing that if we can control our environment, then nothing can disturb our inner peace. Nothing can bother us within if we can make everything perfect and controlled on the outside. It's a mindset that if nothing on the outside can disturb us within, then we can remain in our little bubble of peace. So anyone who has this mindset has made it their life's mission to avoid feeling any pain, and they do so by trying to remove any external that could trigger them internally, that could cause them an inner disturbance. Another thing it does is it leads a lot of us to want to stay within our comfort zones because we know inside that bubble, inside that comfort zone, that's where we're less likely to get triggered and where we're less likely to be bothered and disturbed. There's less risk for flaws to enter. So personally in my life, ways that perfectionism has reared its head is really a desire to control events, people, and outcomes, really. It's a desire to control. I often want to make sure everything goes accordingly to plan, to avoid any unexpected or undesired outcomes. So I try to avoid any flaws, any imperfections. And when I can't avoid the flaws or imperfections, my mind automatically gravitates towards the thing that's imperfect or wrong. I always tend to focus on the imperfections, on those things that need to be improved still. So a big element for me is constantly tending to focus on what's off or imperfect rather than focusing on all the progress or good. Maybe some of this resonates with you, and maybe you experience these tendencies or thought patterns, or again, know someone who does. Send this episode to them. But just in case you don't, here are some more ways perfectionism can manifest in our lives according to the Very Well mind. All or nothing thinking, that's an interesting one. Being overly critical, we all experience that. Feeling pushed by fear rather than pulled by your goals or desires. Having unrealistic standards. Focusing on only results and feeling depressed by unmet goals. Fear of failure. check. Procrastination, defensiveness, interesting, and low self-esteem. I think we all experienced that last one as well. So I know every single one of you can resonate with at least one, if not all or most of these. So hopefully now I definitely have your attention. Going back to my experience with perfectionism, I used to believe that I was just extremely type A, that these perfectionist tendencies were just a part of being a highly motivated person. I didn't necessarily think of it as a bad thing. I thought that working so hard and obsessing over really great outcomes was just going to make me successful in life, and ultimately thought that was going to make me happier. But in recent years of turning inward, of self-development, I've discovered that this incessant strive to control externals to such an extreme in order to reach that standard of perfection, it honestly isn't such a positive thing, but it's actually a negative side effect of something much deeper. And beyond that, and more importantly, wasn't making me happy. The more I try to control and make things so perfect, it means I'm just always focused on the imperfections. And that's not really a happy or lighthearted way to live. It made everything in life feel unsatisfying and stressful because I was striving for this impossible standard in every single aspect of my life. And in turn, I would expect that same standard and level from the people in my life, which isn't good for relationships as well. So that's another reason why it's important to even listen to this or share this with someone who you're close to with perfectionism, because it honestly really impacts the relationships in your lives as well. Another really important thing to note is there's a big difference between being a perfectionist versus being a high achiever. So I think a lot of us who experience these perfectionist tendencies often just brush it off and say, oh, we're just a high achiever or really motivated. But there's a big difference here between the two. So one primary difference is a perfectionist desires to be flawless, to have zero mistakes or flaws, imperfections. Whereas a high achiever simply strives to be great. So let's dive into some more differences here just to clarify. So perfectionist, here are the qualities. Sets high goals and accepts nothing less than perfect in meeting said goals. Can spot any tiny imperfections and mistakes in their work and in others' work. Beats themselves up whenever high expectations are not met, afraid of failure, tends to procrastinate because of fear or not doing something perfectly, and takes constructive criticism defensively. Whereas a high achiever sets high goals and is satisfied if they get close, but maybe don't meet the exact goal. Takes pride in their work and supports others' work even if there's mistakes that exist. Can bounce back easily from disappointment or unmet goals. Are not afraid of failure. Are not likely to procrastinate because they have a mindset of done is better than perfect. And finally, sees constructive criticism as a valuable insight and information. So this is a really interesting way to compare whether we have perfectionist tendencies or whether we're more just a high achiever. And we might sway back and forth, but the whole idea is how can we attain more of a high achiever mindset rather than this perfectionist mindset? Because I almost think of like a big bell curve. If you're a high achiever, you're at the top of that bell curve and achieving a lot. But then when you start to stray towards perfectionism, you think that by going further on the curve, by trying to rid of any imperfections or mistakes, that you're gonna be more successful, but really you just start to sink down on the bell curve. So I like that visual in terms of comparing perfectionism to being a high achiever. And really, we don't want to be perfect. We just want to be good enough and do our best. So now that we've established what perfectionism is and what it could look like in our lives, how is perfectionism holding us back? And why is it perhaps a bad thing when a lot of us think it could be just a good thing? Perfectionism is holding us back in more ways than one. First thing, we cannot control what happens to us in this world, no matter how much we would like to think that we can. What happens externally has absolutely nothing to do with our internal feelings about it, and they're going to occur regardless of them. So attempting to control the external is automatically just setting ourselves up for failure. We can try all we want to make things perfect on the outside of us, but there's always going to be things that happen, things that go against our expectations, things that might upset us. So the more we try to control, especially control things that are outside of our control, we're really just setting ourselves up for failure and disappointment. The second way perfectionism isn't really a great thing in our lives is because no matter how much we try to make, quote, perfect outside of us, we'll never feel internally at peace. It's deep-rooted fears that we're all attempting to run away from by trying to avoid anything on the outside upsetting us internally. If you're afraid of being rejected by friends, you're going to try to obsessively be the perfect friend and constantly be reaching out to make social plans and avoid the possibility of that fear coming to fruition, fear of rejection. Or maybe you're afraid of failure or being less than. So you work overtime to get the good review, get that bonus, assure you're going to be a success at work. But these are examples of letting our fears push us rather than letting our desires pull us. And I love that differentiator there, because if we're letting our fear push us, that's constantly making us live in this negative low frequency, in this state of fear. Whereas if we let our desires pull us, that brings us into this high frequency state, into this state of desire and excitement and passion. And additionally, waiting for something to be perfect or waiting for a situation to be perfect will mean that we're waiting forever. Because guess what? Perfection doesn't exist. Perfectionism often actually is just an excuse or a disguise for procrastination. If you have perfectionist tendencies, think of how many times you've held off going for something or submitting that thing or finishing that project because you told yourself it wasn't, quote, perfect yet. Waiting for something to be perfect, waiting for the perfect time, waiting for the perfect product or outcome is essentially putting your life on hold and preventing you from living your life to the fullest, because you're never going to get to that point where you feel like it's perfect. Some additional ways that I'm throwing out that perfectionism is bad for us is it means that we're prone to burnout and depression, because we're constantly putting effort towards striving for this perfection, and it's an unreachable state and it's exhausting. And so we're constantly just feeling disappointed or like a failure. Next one is we focus on things that don't matter. I'm going to get to this one when we shift to our mindset shifts, but yeah, we try to perfect things that like really don't make a difference. And then finally, it holds us back from taking risks and being creative, because as I mentioned earlier, we're inclined to just stay within our comfort zone, within that little bubble, because we don't think that we can be hurt or touched or bothered there. So it holds us back from exploiting that creative side of us, that unique gift that we can share with the world. If we're scared of it not being perfect, then we're holding ourselves back in a big way. Okay, the part that maybe you're all waiting for. How can we start to overcome this perfectionism, or at least practice mindset shifts to stray away from it? First piece of insight is practice leaning into imperfection. This has been a big one for me lately, and honestly has been so impactful. So lately I've leaned into imperfection and leaned into the messiness and the chaos at times. And I've noticed that the more that I lean into this, and the more that I come out on the other side realizing everything is okay, even if it's not perfect, the more I unlearn the need for perfectionism or unlearn needing to strive for every single thing to be perfect. And also reminding yourself that you don't need to be perfect to be great. Great does not equal perfect. So a lot of us have been told the narrative that we have to be perfect, and we've trained our minds for this standard of perfection. Again, like I said earlier, perfectionism's only on the rise since the 1980s. More and more of us have this ingrained within us that we have to be perfect. So this is going to take a lot of unlearning and constantly practicing embracing imperfection and reminding ourselves that our best is good enough. Second great mindset shift is shifting our internal narrative to radical acceptance. We can recognize that pain and disturbance are unavoidable parts of life. And the quicker we recognize this, the easier life will be, because we're going to stop trying to avoid them at every twist and turn. But pain and disturbance don't have to be such a painful thing or such a scary thing. We can let whatever comes up within us when, like any trigger or uncomfortable feeling rises. What if we just let it pass through us? Because the less we resist that feeling and the quicker we just let it pass through without being scared of it and without identifying with it, we realize how temporary it is. And that is just a part of being a human being. We're not supposed to be happy all the time. Like, things are going to enter our lives that trigger us, but just let it pass through and let it go. It's far easier and far more transformative than trying to avoid pain or discomfort at every twist and turn. It's even more exhausting and painful to constantly work in overtime to try to make our lives perfect and avoid anything that can trigger us. It's only going to leave us feeling drained and disappointed. And like we talked about earlier, leaves a lot of us feeling depressed. People who struggle with perfectionism often experience more signs of burnout and depression. We cannot protect ourselves from external triggers, but what we can do is let them pass through us by radically being open to what comes up and letting it pass through. So more of like a deep bit of a spiritual practice there, but I find it really effective. Another one is assess the importance or unimportance of whatever you're obsessing over. So when I pause and ask myself if what I'm wasting all this energy and headspace on is actually important, 99% of the time, I decide it's not worth it. Okay, some examples here. So sometimes I'll try to be way too perfect about what I eat, about my diet. Anytime I hear something might not be good for you, like those seed oils recently or whatever, I try to avoid it at every single twist and turn. Every single day, I'm like on the lookout for bad things that I can avoid putting into my body. But then I pause and I'm like, okay, is this obsession, is this headspace and trying to make my diet perfect really serving me? And then I come to the realization that it's not. And actually, it's draining me by wasting so much headspace on it. You know, the whole point is to try to make your life better by eating healthy. But if it's coming to a point where you're trying to be so perfect with it that it's causing you more stress, ask if that's worth it. Ask if that's important enough. Because at the end of the day, we can remind ourselves that our bodies can handle anything in moderation. And so finding that balance is key and not obsessing over it or trying to be perfect. Another example is waiting to post or upload something until it's absolutely perfect. If I did that, then I would have 0 podcast episodes posted. I would have 0 Instagram reels posted. Nobody's focused on those tiny imperfections except for you. And so when you remind yourself that you think the spotlight's on you, but really everyone's more focused on themselves and you're the only one scrutinizing and beating yourself up for those imperfections, it really takes the load off and takes the importance off of it. Or finally, maybe you're, trying to find the perfect outfit or the perfect restaurant to go to on that date, or when your family comes into town and you scrutinize it so much because you just want to find the perfect outfit or place or whatever, and you just waste so much energy and headspace on it. But just practice pausing and zooming out and looking at the grand scheme and being like, okay, that is good enough. Great, moving on. Again, you're the only one analyzing those imperfections. Another mindset shift, focusing on progress instead of perfection. So like we mentioned above, high achievers have an easier time enjoying the process and the journey because they can handle mistakes and constructive criticism a lot better than perfectionists. Because perfectionists tend to fear any kind of mistakes or criticism because they take it as a sign of failure and they automatically think, like it wasn't perfect, black or white, like we failed. But if we shift to focusing on the process and learning from criticism and mistakes, instead of seeing them as failures or setbacks or meaning that we're less than, this is such an effective mindset shift away from perfectionism and towards having a healthier relationship with achievement. Again, towards that high point on the bell curve, toward just being a high achiever, but we have flaws and that's okay. Also helpful and related to this, rather than comparing ourselves to others, highlighting all the ways we're less than or behind, it's far more empowering and beneficial to compare to our past selves. And that also takes us back to progress. We can say, okay, well, me a month ago would have handled this totally differently. Or look at how far back I was a month ago and look at where I am now. That allows us to appreciate how much progress we've been making. And last mindset shift, mistakes and imperfections are how we learn. And life is all about learning and growing from each and every experience. So think about it. If every single thing in your life was perfect, and if we didn't have things to learn from, life would be pretty damn boring. So instead of taking things as criticism and consider every single mistake or flaw or imperfection as a negative thing, what if we instead consider it feedback? How can we improve and grow from these mistakes and imperfections? This immediately shifts our mindset from seeing it as a negative to a positive. So instead of feeling offended or like a failure, we can feel curious and appreciative, because if we didn't have things to learn from in life, we would be stagnant. And again, life would be really boring. So shifting from criticism to feedback, mistakes are a good thing. That was my last piece of advice. So let go of trying to make things perfect and let go of trying to be perfect. Because ending with a quote that I love, as Suzuki Roshi says, "You are perfect as you are, and you could use some improvement." Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Unfulfilled. Again, if you're not already, please press follow or subscribe wherever you are listening. It will allow you access to episodes every single Monday when they come out. And send this to a friend in your life who really needs to hear this episode. I love you all. Thank you for tuning in. So grateful for you. And I'll see you soon on your journey to becoming more fulfilled.